we continue our journey through the armed forces of NATO. And today, we arrive at the member that fits the template the least of any we have covered so far, the Republic of Turkey. Until now, our episodes have shared a convenient organizing principle. Finland, Poland, the Baltic States, each of them built its army around a single adversary to the east. And it made sense to measure everything, including doctrine, procurement, mobilization, against the prospect of a Russian attack. More controversially, but it also made sense to compare them with Ukraine. Turkey breaks that frame entirely. Yes, Turkey is a NATO member and has been since 1952, and yes, it shares the Black Sea with Russia, but the Turkish military is not in any meaningful way postured against Moscow. It is postured against everyone. Over the past decade, it has fought in Syria, struck targets in Iraq, intervened in Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh, garrisoned a third of an island in the Mediterranean, mock dogfought the air force of another NATO country, Greece, and watched its relationship with Israel collapse from quiet cooperation into open hostility. Meanwhile, it buys Russian air defense systems, depends on Russian gas while helping them to bypass the Western sanctions, all while selling combat drones and ammunition to Ukraine that kill Russian soldiers. If someone has mastered multipolarity inside NATO, it's without a doubt Turkey. Our argument, which we will build across this video, is this. Turkey's grand strategy over the last 15 years, often called strategic autonomy, was a complex bet. For a country sitting between three competing power blocks, it may even have been the smart play. But together with countless advantages, it also means that a few missteps could quickly turn everyone against it, making the approach quite controversial. Geographically, Turkey is almost surrounded by conflicts. To the west, it borders Greece and Bulgaria. To the northeast, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, including Azerbaijan's Nakhchivan enclave. To the east, Iran. To the south, Iraq and Syria. It has a coastline on 4 seas, the Black Sea, the Sea of Marmara, the Aegean, and the Mediterranean, which means its navy is permanently split across 3 separate theaters that cannot reinforce each other quickly. Yet, it owns the 2 doors between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Turkey regulates the passage of warships through those straits, and in February of 2022, it used that authority to close them to the belligerents of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Internally, the country divides into 3. The west is urbanized, industrialized, and holds most of the population and economic weight. The center is the high Anatolian Plateau, and the southeast is mountainous, rural, and Kurdish, the hinterland of a 4-decade insurgency that has shaped Turkish military thinking more than any external war. The modern republic was founded in 1923 by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk out of the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire, and from the beginning, its military was both a Western-style general staff and a self-appointed guardian of the secular state, a role it enforced with 4 coups between 1960 and 1997. Turkey earned its NATO membership the hard way by sending troops to the Korean War and joining the alliance in 1952. Then came 1974 and the intervention in Cyprus, which left roughly 30,000 Turkish troops permanently stationed across the northern third of the island, where they remain to this day. That intervention also triggered a U.S. arms embargo that lasted 4 years and was the catalyst for a, back then, modest domestic defense industry. The PKK insurgency began in 1984 and has killed more than 40,000 people over 4 decades, and it is the conflict that has defined the Turkish Army's actual lived experience, with mountain warfare, counterinsurgency, cross-border raids, far more than any conventional scenario. But the true inflection point on the modern force is the 15th of July 2016, the failed coup attempt. On that night, rebel officers flew F-16s over Ankara and bombed the parliament building, while loyalist pilots struck the rebels' airfields. The coup failed, and then came the purge. In the aftermath, the government dismissed or arrested roughly 150 generals and admirals. Close to half the Flag Officer Corps, shuttered the Air Force Academy, and, most catastrophically, summarily fired hundreds of fighter pilots. By credible accounts, well over 700 trained pilots were dismissed, from a force that had only around 1,300 to begin with. For a period, Turkey had fewer combat pilots than it did combat aircraft. After 2016, the force pivoted hard from domestic counterinsurgency towards expeditionary operations. Operation Euphrates Shield, then Olive Branch, then Peace Spring, carved out a Turkish-controlled buffer in northern Syria. The Claw operations hammered the PKK in northern Iraq. In Libya in 2019 and 2020, Turkish drones shredded the air defense of a Russian-backed faction. In the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War, Turkish drones handed Azerbaijan a decisive victory and made the word Bayraktar globally famous. And in February of 2020, in Idlib, after 34 of its soldiers were killed by Syrian government strikes, Turkey unleashed those same drones against Syrian armor and air defenses in a confrontation that brought it to the very edge of direct war with Russia. Then at the end of 2024, the ground shifted again. The Assad regime in Syria collapsed, an outcome Turkey had quietly enabled, and overnight the southern frontier was rewritten. Turkish-backed forces pushed the Kurdish-led SDF out of key towns, and a fragile agreement was reached to fold those Kurdish forces into the new Syrian state. As of early 2026, that integration is incomplete, and the question of whether Turkey resumes operations against the SDF remains very much open. On paper, Turkey is a solid ally, NATO's second-largest army, historical host of American tactical nuclear weapons at Incirlik Air Base under the alliance's nuclear sharing arrangement, and home to the Korecik radar station, a key sensor in NATO's ballistic missile defense network. It exceeded the alliance's 2% spending target, it will host a NATO summit, and Turkish officers command allied missions abroad. In practice, Turkey is the alliance's most independent and most exasperating member, and the Sweden-Finland ascension is the perfect illustration. When the two states applied to join NATO after 2022, Turkey blocked them, and then extracted a price. It ratified Finland's membership in 2023 and Sweden's only in early 2024, and the timing was so that within a day of Turkey's ratification reaching Washington, the United States cleared a long-stalled package of 40 new F-16s and dozens of modernization kits. Turkey, in other words, traded its alliance veto for fighter jets, a clean illustration of a state that puts its own interests above alliance solidarity. The same rule is present in its relationships with Russia. Turkey bought the S-400 air defense system from Moscow in 2017, took delivery in 2019, and in doing so, destroyed its relationship with Washington. Russian gas supplies something like 40% of Turkey's imports, and the Turkstream pipeline is now the last remaining route for Russian gas into Europe. And yet, Turkey closed the straits to Russian warships, and the very same company that makes Turkey's drones has been selling those drones to Ukraine, and even building factories there. What was once a quiet partnership with Israel, Israeli optics and electronics quietly embedded in Turkish drones and armored vehicles, has, since the Gaza war, collapsed into open antagonism, though one has not yet crossed the line. Turkey has imposed a trade embargo, closed its ports and airspace to Israeli state traffic, and led international efforts to pressure Israel diplomatically. And Greece, a fellow NATO member, remains a live military rival. A 1995 Turkish parliamentary resolution still formally declares that any Greek extension of its Aegean territorial waters would be grounds for war, a standing threat of war against formerly an ally. We always end this section with our recurring skeptical assessment of how much deterrence alliance membership really provides. With Turkey, the skepticism cuts in an unusual direction. For most members, the worry is whether NATO would show up and whether it would do so in time. For Turkey, the more honest worry is the reverse. This is an ally whose interests so often diverge from the alliance's that, in a crisis on Turkey's own terms, in the Aegean, in the Eastern Mediterranean, against the SDF, against Israel, NATO might not show up at all, because it might not agree that Turkey is in the right, which is precisely why Turkey has built itself to fight without it. The country has a population of roughly 85 million, which makes it one of the largest in NATO. Its economy produces somewhere around $1.5 trillion in nominal GDP, placing it among the world's 20 largest, though that figure has been a moving target thanks to years of currency turmoil. That currency turmoil is the lens through which you have to read every Turkish defense number. The 2026 defense and security budget comes to roughly $27 billion US, and on paper that is a significant increase of about 30% on the previous year. But Turkey has been running inflation around 30% and a lira that has collapsed against the dollar. So most of that growth is the currency shrinking, not the military growing. In real terms, spending sits at around 2% of GDP, with Ankara now committed to a path towards 2.8% in 2027, over 3% in 2028, 2028 and eventually NATO's new 5% target by the middle of the next decade. Turkey maintains an active force of roughly 355,000 personnel, the bulk of them, around 260,000, in the army. Behind that sits a trained reserve of close to 400,000 and a heavily armed paramilitary establishment of over 150,000 in the Gendarmerie and Coast Guard, both now under the Interior Ministry but fully militarized and combat capable. In the southeast, tens of thousands of state-paid village guards serve as local auxiliaries against the PKK. Manpower is generated through conscription. Turkish men serve 6 months, with reserve liability lasting into their 40s, and there is a permanent paid exemption scheme that lets those who can afford the fee buy their way down to a single month of basic training. It is a pragmatic system for a country this size, and unlike the other NATO members, Turkey has never had to worry about whether it can field enough men. After all, its land forces are the largest army in NATO outside the United States, somewhere around 260,000 troops, run from a single land forces command in Ankara, and organized into 4 field armies. The first army sits in Istanbul in Thrace, guarding the European part of the country and the approaches to the straits. It holds the heaviest concentration of armor. The second army covers the southeast, facing Syria and Iraq, and it is the formation that has actually fought. The counter-PKK and cross-border campaigns are largely its war. The third army holds the east, watching the Caucasus and Iran. Beneath each sit several corps, and below those a force that, since the post-2016 reorganization, has shifted away from heavy divisions towards more flexible, self-contained brigades, armored, mechanized infantry, and commando. And then there is the fourth, the Aegean Army in Izmir. It is deliberately kept outside NATO's integrated command. It was created after the 1974 Cyprus intervention and never assigned to the alliance for one very transparent reason. It exists to be usable against Greece, a fellow NATO member, without asking anyone's permission. It also controls Turkey's amphibious forces and the roughly 30,000 strong garrison in northern Cyprus. When we said earlier that Turkey is the rare ally that has built itself to fight alone, this is the proof of it. 1/4 of its standing army is structurally walled off from the alliance, precisely so it can be turned on the alliance's own southeastern flank. The workhorses of the last decade, though, are not the armored brigades, but the commando brigades, the light, mountain-capable infantry formations that have done the bulk of the actual fighting in the southeast, in Iraq, and in Syria. This is an army with a real, recent, hard-won institutional memory of combat. The question, which we will keep returning to, is whether that memory is the right one for the war it might actually have to fight next. Now to equipment. Turkey fields a large but frankly chaotic tank fleet, well over 2,000 main battle tanks in service, with hundreds more in reserve. At the modern end are just over 300 German Leopard 2A4s, now finally being upgraded. The middle tier is fairly obsolete American armor, several hundred M60s, including around 170 M60T Sabra variants, which were modernized, awkwardly, by Israel. A portion of them now fitted with the locally made Pulat active protection system. The bottom tier is hundreds of aging Leopard 1s and M48s in declining or reserve roles. After more than a decade of delays, Turkey's indigenous main battle tank, Altay, finally entered serial production, with the first vehicles handed over in October 2025, and roughly 250 planned at a modest cadence of around 8 a month. The Altay is also the perfect example of the engine problem that haunts this whole episode. It was meant to use a German power pack until Germany imposed an embargo over Turkey's Syria operations, so the first tanks run on South Korean engines and transmissions, while Turkey races to build its own. We already know how Turkish tanks perform in a modern threat environment because we watched it happen. At Al Bab in Syria, in late 2016 and early 2017, Turkish Leopard 2A4s were knocked out in numbers by anti-tank missiles and IEDs, several with catastrophic ammunition cook-offs that destroyed the entire vehicle. That episode exposed the obvious. Tanks designed in the 20th century are desperately vulnerable to modern threats, and the arrival of FPV drones has only sharpened the lesson. The Altay is meant to carry an active protection system against exactly those threats, but until that is fielded and proven at scale, Turkey's armored force is the kind of expensive, underprotected fleet that the drone and missile battlefield punishes hardest. The individual infantryman, for his part, is equipped to roughly NATO average standard, carrying the domestic MPT-70 MP-76 and MPT-55 rifles, and broadly modern personnel kit, all of it produced domestically. The interesting story is one level up, in armor. Turkey fields one of the most diverse armored vehicle fleets in the world, and here the diversity is largely a strength, because almost all of it is built and sustained locally. The tracked ACV-15, the wheeled PARs in 6- and 8-wheel forms, and, above all, an enormous protected mobility fleet of more than 1,500 Kirpi mine-resistant vehicles, backed by thousands more across a dozen other mine-protected and light armored types like the Yelchin, the Varan, the Cobra, and the Akrep, all layered on top of a still vast legacy of thousands of M113s. Reconnaissance, meanwhile, still leans on Cold War holdovers, Scout-configured Cobras, and a thinning tail of old American and German wheeled vehicles, with newer Scout variants of the Arma and PARs only gradually replacing them. Yet, for all its variety, Turkey has no true modern heavy infantry fighting vehicle in mass service. The platforms that should fill that role, the tracked Otokar Tulpar and the FNSS Kalpan family, exist as designs and prototypes but have not been fielded in numbers. The actual workhorse remains the ACV-15, a fundamentally 1960s American hull with a modern coat of paint. So while Turkey can put an enormous amount of armor on wheels, the heavy, well-protected autocannon-armed IFV that a peer fight demands is, as of early 2026, still a gap. Hundreds of Turkish protected vehicles, the Kirpi above all, were sent to Ukraine, and the verdict has been genuinely positive on the one thing they were designed for. Crews repeatedly walked away from mine and artillery strikes that would have killed them in a thin-skinned truck, and the Kirpi earned a solid reputation for survivability and reliability. In the towed artillery category, Turkey still fields large numbers of older pieces, the 155mm Panther, legacy American M114s and M101s, with the new lightweight Baran beginning to come in. Self-propelled firepower is anchored by some 280 T-155 Fırtına howitzers, a Turkish development of the South Korean K-9, firing standard 155mm NATO shells out to around 40 kilometers, now being succeeded by the indigenous engine Fırtına 2, while a tale of legacy American self-propelled guns, the M52, the M44, M110, and M107, lingers in reserve and adds yet more calibers to the logistics burden. Mortars, including heavy 120mm types, are carried on ACV-15s and wheeled chassis as well as towed in the thousands. Rocket artillery runs the 122mm Sakuraya up through the heavy Kasirga and into the precision tier with the guided TRG-300 Tiger and the TRLG-230 rockets, which trade saturation for GPS-class accuracy out to around 120 kilometers. Turkey also operates a small fleet of around a dozen American M270 tracked MLRS launchers, the same heavy system Poland and Finland field, and crucially, these give it the launch platform for the MGM-140 ATACMS ballistic missile, of which Turkey holds an estimated 70-odd, one of only a handful of NATO armies in Europe to operate the type. At the very top sits something most NATO members lack entirely, a real indigenous ballistic missile deep strike arm. The Bora reaches around 280 kilometers with a roughly 470 kilogram blast fragmentation or unitary penetrator warhead, and the larger Typhoon has been tested well beyond 500, carrying a heavier conventional warhead, roughly 500 kilos. Land-based air defense is one of Turkey's most impressive recent strides. The Steel Dome, a layered AI-fused architecture that ties everything into one network. At the bottom sit point defense systems, the radar-guided Korkut twin 35mm gun, and the Sungur short-range missile, reaching only a handful of kilometers, meant to kill drones, helicopters, and low-flying aircraft. In the middle is the Hisar family, covering roughly 15 to 25 kilometers. At the top is the new long-range indigenous Seeper, intended to engage aircraft and missiles out past 100 kilometers, the rough class of the American Patriot, though far less combat-proven. Merging it all together are domestic radars, electronic warfare systems, and a national command network, alongside older vehicle-mounted Stinger launchers like the Atogan and Zipkin, and a legacy belt of American Hawk batteries still being phased out. Turkey is even fielding a laser system, Gökberk, aimed squarely at drones. The concept is right, layered, networked, increasingly homegrown. The open question is the one that shadows every air defense system we cover: magazine depth. A solid network is only as good as the interceptors stacked behind it, and on that, Turkey, like everyone else, is not telling. Army aviation centers on around 60 T-129 ATAK attack helicopters, a Turkish build of an Italian design, backed by roughly 50 older AH-1 Cobras, with the heavier indigenous T-929 having begun entered service in 2025. Both Turkish designs are shadowed by the engine problem. The T-129's American-controlled engine has repeatedly blocked its export, and the T-929 is being powered, of all things, by a Ukrainian engine. The utility fleet is large and diverse: legacy Cougars, the new domestic Gokbey, and license-built Blackhawks, though even there, the home-built T-70 has trickled in at barely a dozen of more than 100 planned, throttled by the same American sanctions. The pattern is, by now, familiar. Turkey can design and build almost anything, except the thing that makes it move. Turkey's Special Operations Forces, the famous Maroon Berets, are among the most combat-tested in NATO, with sustained operations across Syria, Iraq, and Libya, backed by elite naval, police, and gendarmerie units, well over 10,000 operators in total. Unlike most of their European counterparts, they have actually been fighting for a decade, though we should be precise, mostly against insurgents and militias, not a peer army. Which leads to the assessment: this is a large, modernizing, genuinely battle-hardened army that would dominate any single regional neighbor on the ground, with weaknesses that are not unique to it. The legacy fleet is a standardization and maintenance burden across tanks, IFVs, and artillery calibers alike. The armor's survivability against modern anti-tank fire is a proven, not theoretical problem. And most importantly, despite all of Turkey's drone offense, there is little public evidence that the army has internalized the defensive half of the Ukraine lesson. The FPV threat, the need for battalion and brigade-level drone and counter-drone teams, and electronic warfare at real scale. FPVs and cheap loitering munitions are spreading fast across the Middle East into the hands of exactly the friends and foes who in this region have a habit of trading places. An army built to win the counterinsurgency wars of the last decade is not automatically built to survive the drone war of the next one. And on current evidence, Turkey, for all its hardware, has yet closed that distance. Now to the Air Force. Its backbone is a fleet of roughly 240 F-16s, the second largest such fleet in the world. That sounds formidable until you realize how old much of it is. Turkey's plans to modernize these jets has itself been a saga. A massive American upgrade package was largely set aside in favor of a cheaper domestic program called Özgür, while a separate order for 40 brand new F-16s sits tangled in pricing and politics, hung up partially on Turkey's insistence on fitting its own radar and getting access to the jet's source code. Behind the F-16s, astonishingly, Turkey still flies around 30 F-4 Phantom, a 1960s design, which it intends to keep airborne until around 2030, simply because it has nothing else to put in their place. Turkey did finally retire its last F-5 Freedom Fighters from the combat role years ago, though a handful live on in a second career as the mounts of the Turkish Stars aerobatic display team. A small reminder of just how deep this Air Force's bench of Cold War metal runs. And that brings us to the F-35, the centerpiece of this episode's central argument. Turkey was not just a customer for the F-35, it was a partner, manufacturing over 1,000 components for the global fleet. It ordered around 100 jets, and then in 2019, because it insisted on buying the Russian S-400 at the same time, Washington threw it out of the program entirely. Turkey lost the aircraft it had partly built, lost its place in the supply chain, lost roughly $1.5 billion it had already paid, and got hit with sanctions on top. 6 finished Turkish F-35s, paid for and built, still sit in storage in the United States. This is the moment where strategic autonomy stops being a clever hedge and starts being a strategic own goal. Turkey traded the most capable Western fighter of its generation for a Russian air defense system that, to this day, sits in storage, never integrated into NATO's network, militarily useless, and is now reportedly being dangled back to Moscow in the hope of buying a way back into the F-35 program. To reiterate, Turkey may end up returning the very weapon it sacrificed the F-35 to acquire. If there is a more vivid illustration of a strategy that failed on its own terms, we have not found it. So what fills the gap? 2 things, both years away. The first is the Khan, Turkey's indigenous 5th-generation fighter, which made its first flight in early 2024. It is a real and genuinely impressive achievement. The first full flight test prototype is due up around mid-2026. Indonesia has already signed a framework deal for nearly 50 aircraft. Saudi Arabia is in talks, and the Turkish Air Force has placed its first order, around 20 Block 10 jets, due between 2028 and 2030. But serial deliveries have already slipped from 2028 to 2029. The early jets will fly on American engines, because the indigenous one is not expected until 2032, and a real frontline fleet is, optimistically, a mid-2030s proposition. The second stopgap is the Eurofighter Typhoon, a deal signed in October of 2025 for 20 new jets from Britain, after Germany lifted a long-standing veto, with a dozen second-hand jets each from Qatar and Oman, arriving sooner to bridge the gap, building towards a fleet of around 44. The new British aircraft, though, are not due until roughly 2030. Turkey is also having genuine export success with its own Hurjet trainer and light attack jet, recently sold to Spain in its first export of a manned combat aircraft to a NATO ally, which is a nice industrial story, but does nothing to solve the fighter shortfall. That fighter line, by the way, sits on top of a substantial training ecosystem, the kind of thing easy to overlook but essential to regenerating a hollow-out pilot corps. Turkey runs dozens of T-38 supersonic jet trainers alongside the new domestic Hurjet that will eventually replace them, with propeller trainers like the Korean-designed KT-1 and the home-built Herkus. Rounding out the force, the Airborne Early Warning Fleet, 4 Boeing 737-based aircraft Turkey calls Peace Eagle. This deserves a moment because it is one of the most important and least appreciated assets in the entire Turkish military. An AWACS is the flying radar and command post that lets a fighter force see deep, coordinate, and fight as a network rather than as scattered individual jets. And most of the countries we have covered in this series have none at all, relying entirely on NATO's shared fleet. Turkey owns its own, fitted with a powerful active radar and now being upgraded with indigenous Aselsan electronic intelligence systems, which means that even in a crisis where the alliance sits on its hands, Turkey can still generate its own air picture and run its own air battle. Backing it are a pair of new bombardier-based standoff jamming aircraft entering service, 7 aging KC-135 tankers, and a respectable transport fleet of 10 A400Ms, alongside older C-130s and a large fleet of CN-235s. Rotary wing search and rescue and utility work falls to Cougars and a large pool of legacy UH-1 Hueys. The honest assessment is harsh. Even after Eurofighters and the new F-16s arrive, Turkey will field one of the oldest fighter fleets in NATO, with no 5th-generation aircraft until at least the end of the decade, and a shortage of true air superiority platforms. Meanwhile, Greece, its most likely peer adversary, will be flying F-35s and Rafales before then. For a country that prides itself on regional dominance, the air is the one domain where, for the next several years, it has real rivals, and the cause of that gap was a choice Turkey made itself. The Turkish Navy is, by contrast, managed a little better, and it has to operate across 3 separate seas at once. The Black Sea, the Aegean, and the Mediterranean, with around 45,000 personnel and its own maritime brigade, special forces detachments, and naval aviation. Beneath the surface, Turkey runs 13 conventional submarines. Most are older German-designed Type 209 boats, the Adelaide, Previs, and Gur classes, but the first 2 of 6 new Type 214 Reese-class submarines, built at home and fitted with air-independent propulsion that lets them stay submerged far longer than a conventional boat, are now in service, with the second handed over at the very end of 2025, and the third already in the water. And in a major step towards true autonomy, Turkey has begun building its own national submarine, the Mildin, entirely indigenous, expected in the water in the early 2030s, with an even more ambitious nuclear-powered submarine, the Nukden, already on the drawing board beyond that. On the surface, Turkey fields around 16 to 17 frigates, a mix of aging German-designed Miko 200s, the Yavuz and Barbaros classes, and 8 ex-American Gabia hulls, the heavily modernized former Oliver Hazard Perry frigates, plus the genuinely modern domestic line that all of those point towards, the Milgem program. Its first Istif-class frigate, commissioned in early 2024, with 7 more on order, and the broader Milgem family has become a serious export earner, with corvettes sold to Pakistan and Ukraine. Below the frigates sit the corvette force, 4 modern Ada-class anti-submarine corvettes, and 5 older Burak-class light corvettes, the latter being ex-French vessels. Here, though, comes the flag we have to raise on almost every surface ship in this fleet: air defense. The older Miko and Gabia-class frigates, as well as the newer Ada corvettes, carry only short-range point defense missiles, adequate against a single incoming threat, but easily overwhelmed by a saturation attack, and the Ada corvettes in particular have essentially no area air defense at all, relying on a gun and a close-in point defense system. In other words, most of the Turkish fleet would be dangerously exposed to modern anti-ship missiles and drone swarms. That is precisely why the next program matters so much. The larger Istanbul-class batch and, above all, the dedicated TF-2000 air defense frigates, now under construction, are meant to give the fleet, for the first time, a proper long-range naval shield, the capability gap that crippled, for instance, the Polish Navy. Looking even further ahead, Turkey has outlined an 8-ship Tepe-class guided missile destroyer program and a national aircraft carrier, Mujem, larger than anything it operates today. The lighter end of the fleet is large and busy. Turkey fields roughly 17 fast attack and missile craft, the Kilik, the Yildiz, and the Dohan and the Ruzgar classes, small, fast boats armed with Harpoon or the new domestic ATM-ACA anti-ship missiles, well suited to the confined waters of the Aegean. Patrol duties fall to around 16 Tuzla-class coastal vessels, with the new Hisar-class offshore patrol ships now joining. Mine warfare is in fact a real strength. Turkey operates around 11 dedicated mine hunters of the relatively modern Aydin and Engin classes, a serious capability way above the average NATO country. For Turkey, the foundational naval memory is Gallipoli, where in 1915, sea mines, geography, and coastal guns helped stop a far larger Allied fleet in the Dardanelles. The war in Ukraine has only reinforced that same point. Mines, both on land and sea, did not lose value. Around the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, the Black Sea approaches, and the island-choked Aegean, they remain cheap weapons with strategic effect. Amphibious capability is where Turkey clearly outclasses most of NATO's navies in this series. The fleet is anchored by the flagship, the TCG Anadolu, a 27,000-ton amphibious assault ship, and the story of that vessel tells you everything about how Turkey adapts to setbacks. The Anadolu was designed as a light aircraft carrier for the F-35B, the vertical landing variant. When Turkey lost access to the F-35, the ship lost its air wing before it ever embarked one. So Turkey did something genuinely innovative and turned the Anadolu into the world's first operational drone carrier, flying the carrier-capable Bayraktar TB3 from its deck and conducting live strikes during 2025 exercises. Now, we should be clear-eyed about this. A drone carrier is not a substitute for a fixed-wing carrier, but it is a clever, forward-looking workaround that nobody else in the world had fielded at that point. And it points towards where naval aviation may be genuinely heading. Whether it is innovation or merely making the best of a self-inflicted failure is exactly the question that hangs over Turkey's whole defense posture. Beneath the Anadolu sit two large Bayraktar-class landing ships, older Bey and Osmangazi-class tank landing ships, and a whole flotilla of smaller landing craft, giving Turkey the sea lift to move a meaningful ground force onto a contested shore. The exact capability that the Aegean Army and the Cyprus garrison are built around. Naval aviation and the auxiliary fleet round out the picture. Turkey flies maritime patrol and anti-submarine helicopters and aircraft, including ATR-72-based ASW planes, alongside a deep bench of support ships, replenishment oilers, the new Daria logistics support ship, a submarine rescue vessel, and, tellingly, the Ufuk intelligence gathering ship, a dedicated signals intelligence platform for monitoring the busy seas around it. And in keeping with the country's drone obsession, the Navy is now fielding armed unmanned surface vessels, the Marlin, the Sankar, and UALQ families. Exactly the kind of cheap, asymmetric naval system the Ukraine war has shown to be devastating against larger fleets. The realistic wartime role of this navy is sea control and denial in its near seas, mine warfare, amphibious projection, coastal defense, and above all, the strategic leverage of the Monroe Straits. Anti-ship strike has been thoroughly indigenized with the ATM-ACA, a sea-skimming cruise missile with a range of over 200 kilometers, now replacing the American Harpoon across ships, submarines, and coastal batteries. It is a capable, modernizing, genuinely blue water aspirant force, and one of the parts of the Turkish military where the indigenous industry strategy has paid off most cleanly, provided the air defense gap gets closed before it is tested. On the deep strike side, we mentioned the ground-launched Bora and Typhoon ballistic missiles and the American ATACMS, but they are also complemented by the air-launched SOM cruise missile, which gives the F-16 fleet a standoff strike reach of around 250 kilometers, and a longer-range land attack cruise missile in development. Turkey can reach hundreds of kilometers into hostile territory with its own weapons, and is openly working on systems to reach much further. On nuclear weapons, the answer, as our template insists we state plainly, is that Turkey has none, and absence is itself a fact worth stating. Turkey is a non-nuclear state, and a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It does, however, host an estimated 50 American B-61 tactical bombs at Incirlik under NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement, one of the largest such deployments in Europe, but it does not own or control them, and no Turkish aircraft is currently even certified to deliver them. On the space frontier, Turkey operates a modest but real constellation of reconnaissance and communications satellites, including domestically built optical and radar imaging systems, giving it a sovereign intelligence gathering capability that, again, sets it apart from the smaller militaries we have covered. But the crown jewel is drones, and here Turkey is, or at least was, world-leading. The Bayraktar TB2 is the most combat-proven drone of its class on Earth, in service, or on order, with more than 35 nations, and having crossed 1 million flight hours. Above it sits the heavier Akinja, the carrier-capable TB3, the stealthy Anka-3 flying wing, and, most dramatically, the jet-powered Kızılelma. In November of 2025, the Kızılelma did something no unmanned aircraft has ever done. It fired a radar-guided beyond visual range air-to-air missile and destroyed a jet-powered target drone. That is a genuine world first, and it points towards a future of unmanned air combat that Turkey is helping to define. The company behind most of this, Baykar, exported some $2.2 billion in a single year, and, on its own, represents roughly a quarter of Turkey's entire defense export economy. And yet this is where we have to apply the series' most important recurring lens, the lessons of the Russo-Ukrainian War, and deliver an uncomfortable verdict. Turkey's drone advantage is real, but it is eroding. And it is eroding in the one place that matters most. The TB2 and its cousins are exquisite, expensive, medium-altitude systems, the kind of drone that dominated the wars of 2019 to 2022. But the war in Ukraine has since moved on into the realm of mass-produced sub-$1,000 FPVs, recon wings, interceptor drones, and middle to deep strike kamikaze UAVs. In that domain, the one that now decides the fate of front lines, Turkey is not the obvious leader anymore. Its pivot upward to the Kızılelma and the TB3 is strategically smart, but it leaves a question hanging. Does Turkey have the cheap, attritable, mass drone capability and the counter-drone capability that a real peer war now demands? On the offensive side, partially. On the defensive side, like nearly every military in this series, the honest answer appears to be no. Turkey does, at least, have the industrial base and the institutional drone culture to fix this faster than most. That is more than we can say for almost anyone else we have covered. If you take one thing from this episode, take this. The Turkish defense industry is the most genuine and most consequential achievement of the entire Erdogan era, and it is the single best argument that strategic autonomy, whatever its failures elsewhere, was at its core the right instinct. 20 years ago, Turkey produced perhaps a fifth of its own weapons. Today, that figure is claimed at over 80%. The industry is built around a handful of national champions: Aselsan in electronics, radar and air defense, TAI, which builds the Khan, the Hurjet, the attack helicopters, and many of the drones, Roketsan in missiles, Baykar in drones, and a cluster of land systems firms like FNSS, BMC, and Otokar. Several of these now rank among the top 100 defense manufacturers on Earth. The sector employs around 100,000 people and, as we noted, exports crossed $10.5 billion in 2025, much of it, strikingly, to NATO and EU customers. This is the payoff of the lesson learned in 1974. A country that can build, repair, and sustain most of its own arsenal cannot be embargoed into submission. When Germany blocked the Altai's engine, Turkey found another path. When Israel became an adversary, Turkey could, at a cost, begin resourcing components. That resilience is real and genuinely rare. But the bottlenecks are equally real. And the most important one we have already mentioned repeatedly: engines. Turkey can design a fifth-generation fighter, a national tank, a national attack helicopter, and a national submarine, and then has to bolt a foreign power plant into nearly all of them. The fighter-class jet engine is still years away. The high-end semiconductors that go into advanced radars and seekers are largely imported from Western fabs that Turkey does not control. And the loss of the F-35 supply chain work stung an industry that had spent years earning that work share. On financing, the picture is clouded by the lira's instability, and a meaningful share of this rearmament is, as in Poland, being carried on credit and offset by booming export revenue. The export machine is, in a real sense, helping to pay for the modernization, which is a far healthier position than most of the countries we have covered. Now let's imagine the realistic conflicts. Turkey does not have one primary threat, it has a menu. A flare-up with Greece in the Aegean, a renewed campaign against the SDF in Syria or the PKK in Iraq, a confrontation with Israel over Syrian airspace, a crisis around Cyprus. In almost none of these scenarios is Russia the principal adversary, which is precisely why Turkey breaks the mold of this series. On land, in any of these regional fights, Turkey holds, and more than holds, it dominates. It fields the largest, most combat-experienced army in NATO outside the United States, with genuine deep strike, layered home-built air defenses, and forces that have actually fought, not just trained, for a decade. Against any single neighbor, the Turkish army is the decisive instrument. In the air, the picture inverts. This is Turkey's contest but don't dominate domain. And for the next several years, it may not even contest cleanly against a top-tier rival. An aging fighter fleet, a pilot corps still healing from 2016, no fifth-generation aircraft until the end of the decade at the earliest, and a most likely peer adversary, Greece, that will be qualitatively better equipped in the air well before then. The steel dome and the indigenous fighters are the bet that this gap is temporary. The risk is that that bet pays off late. At sea, Turkey is relevant and increasingly capable. A 3-theater navy with submarines, modern frigates, indigenous anti-ship missiles, the region's strongest amphibious arm, a clever drone carrier, and the strategic trump card of the Monroe Straits. But it would go to war with most of its surface fleet unable to defend itself against a serious missile or drone attack, and that vulnerability will persist until the TF-2000 air defense frigates arrive. On strategic capabilities, Turkey is a genuine regional power, real ballistic and cruise deep strike, world-class drones, sovereign satellites, and its own airborne early warning and a missile and air defense industry that most middle powers can only envy. The asterisks are the ones this series always applies. Magazine depth and interceptor stockpiles, which remain unknown and are almost certainly the binding constraint in any sustained high-intensity exchange, and the eroding edge in cheap, mass-produced drone warfare. If the plans land on schedule, the Turkish military of the early 2030s looks formidable. Khan squadrons and Eurofighters closing the air gap, Altay tanks with active protection replacing the legacy fleet, a fully networked steel dome over the major cities, new frigates and submarines giving the Navy real teeth, and an indigenous industry that has finally cracked the engine problem. That is a regional superpower in the making. But this series has taught us to treat modernization plans as promises, not capabilities. And the Turkish programs most critical to that future, the fighter, the engine, the air defense interceptor depth, are exactly the ones most prone to slippage. The Army's failure to grapple seriously with cheap drone offense and defense at scale is the same blind spot we have flagged in Poland, in Finland, and in the Baltics. And Turkey, for all its drone pedigree, has not obviously solved it either. So, we end where we began, with the question of strategic autonomy. The verdict, we think, is mixed and instructive. The instinct, a pivotal nation refusing to be anyone's dependent, built a world-class defense industry, gave Turkey real deep strike and a globe-leading drone sector, and produced a military that can genuinely fight alone. That part worked, but the execution, the S-400, the burned bridges with Washington, the collapse with Israel, the perpetual hedging with Moscow, cost Turkey the F-35, hollowed its air force at the worst possible moment, and left it more isolated than a country of its weight should ever be. Turkey set out to be the master of its own security, and ended up in the one domain that matters most for high-end war, the air, dependent on the goodwill of the very allies it had alienated. And yet, there is one advantage no rival in this series can take from it, and it is the note we want to end on. Turkey is the only military we have covered that has actually been fighting, more or less continuously, for the entire period the rest of Europe spent at peace. Its commanders have run real cross-border offensives. Its drones have killed real armor and real air defenses. Its special forces have spent a decade in the field, and its industry has watched its own products tested in combat and fed the lessons straight back into the next design. That experience is uneven. It was won mostly against insurgents and militias rather than a peer, and it has bred some dangerous habits. Above all, the assumption that the drone-rich, lightly contested wars of the last decade resemble the drone-saturated, heavily contested war of the next one. But combat experience, even imperfect combat experience, is the one thing that cannot be bought, localized, or rushed into production. Most of Europe will have to learn its hardest lessons under fire. Turkey, for better or for worse, already has. Whether it learns the right ones in time is the question that will decide just how much its long, expensive, contradictory gamble on strategic autonomy was finally worth.